I'd like to take a moment to share with you a very simple but profound conversation that I had with a new client. It's my hope that what I shared with her is a help to you, the way it was to her. She is a single 39-year-old woman, no children. She's been single for about 2 months and said, "Doc, I'm coming out of a 3-year relationship." She described the relationship as good when it was good and bad when it was bad. I said, "What do you mean by that?" She said, "Well, it had a lot of high highs and a lot of very low lows. And so when things were great, they were great. When things were bad, they were bad." And she, early on the call, just started to break down and cry. As she was crying, I said to her, I said, "Ma'am, this sounds like a classic toxic relationship. And this is something that I've taught a lot, that toxic relationships are personified by very, very high highs and very, very low lows. And they are not stable because stability represents the middle. And so anytime you're on anything, whether it's a roller coaster or in a relationship, if you go from high to low, high to low, high to low all the time without any relief, what's going to happen?" She said, "Well, somebody's going to get sick." And she said, "Doc, that's exactly what occurred to me. I really got sick in this relationship and I knew it was time to go." She said, "But what made it worse is that prior to this relationship, she had just come out of a 1-year relationship with a man she said physically and emotionally abused her." She said when she came out of that 1-year relationship, it ended and she took about 4 years to work on herself before she decided to date again. She met this gentleman that she was in a 3-year relationship with that just came to an end. And she said when she met him, she found herself back into something not good after a while, but couldn't understand how that came to be. I said, "What do you mean? Just be a little bit more specific." She said, "To put it simply, Doc, I had done a lot of work on myself. I really worked on a lot of things regarding my attachment style, specifically regarding some insecurities that were present in that first abusive relationship, some insecurities that I believe came to surface as a result of being in that relationship. And I really worked on those things and thought that I did a good job of doing that, considering I took 4 years out of the dating market, only to get in another relationship for 3 years that turned out to be, as you say, very toxic." And she said, "Doc, it really just bothers me." She said, "This is very painful because mostly, not only have I worked on myself, I believe that I was absolutely secure when I met this 3-year relationship. I had taken those 4 years and worked on, again, so many insecurities. I was clearly an anxious attachment style when I was in the 1-year abusive relationship. And I took the 4 years and really, really, really worked hard. But then I end up in this relationship," she said, "and it seems like he pulled me from being secure back into anxious. And honestly, Doc, I didn't even think that was possible." I said, "This is a really good conversation." I said, "Ma'am, it is very possible to go from secure to anxious, to go from secure to avoidant, just as it's possible to go from anxious to secure or go from avoidant to secure when we think about attachment styles." I said, "This is very possible. And so, number one, give yourself grace. This doesn't mean that you didn't do the work in those 4 years. I said, what it simply means is that your attachment style and all the work that you did had not been tested. And when you claim to be secure, we don't really know if you're secure until that security is tested." She said, "Well, that makes a lot of sense. It makes me feel better." I said, "It should, because you're beating yourself up as if you weren't secure. And I'm here to tell you that maybe you were secure, but maybe you were secure and just not tested." I said, and let me give you an easy example to make this make sense. She is from the South, the deep South, and she lives in a state that borders water. I said, "You're very familiar with hurricane season, correct?" She said, "I am." I said, "I have a lot of friends who live in New Orleans, and this year is the 20-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. But I want to connect what happened there 20 years ago to your situation." I said, "We all know about Hurricane Katrina. And when that hurricane came, there was a lot of narrative about the city and the storm and how that storm created so much devastation. In fact, a friend of mine told me about a few docuseries on TV that I happened to watch, 2 of them that were really, really, really good, that broke down everything that happened pre-hurricane, during the hurricane, post-hurricane, up until this day." I said, "But ma'am, those levees in New Orleans had never really been tested." And I said, "Ma'am, there are 2 major lessons that storm, specifically in New Orleans, teaches us that I think is very relevant to where you are as it relates to you being pulled from secure attachment to now back in this anxious space. I said, number one, simple storms and hurricanes did not impact those levees prior to Hurricane Katrina. She said, what do you mean by that? I said, New Orleans had experienced some storms prior to Hurricane Katrina. They had experienced some hurricanes. They had been part of the residue of storms that impacted that area. I said, but none of that was strong enough to knock down those levees like Hurricane Katrina, correct? She said, yes, sir. I said, ma'am, you have been through some stuff. You came out of a 1-year abusive relationship. You recovered for 4 years. I said, but the reality is you had never really been through any other storm to test you like this last 3-year relationship. Is that correct? She said, you're right. I stopped dating altogether. I said, so this was the first relationship post the new levees being built. Is that correct? She said, you're talking about the 4 years of work. I said, I am. I said, this is the first major storm, and it looks like this storm knocked over some levees because you're here and you're hurting. Is that correct? She said, you're correct. I said, so the levees had to be tested in order to be trusted. I said, and simple storms and hurricanes didn't impact them, which means, ma'am, to put this simply, we can think we've done the work to heal our attachment style. But the reality is sometimes it takes major storms and major tests in order for our work and the work that we've done on ourselves to be tested so that we feel confident that we are really in this secure space that we're in, that we're really in this grown space that we're in. I said, does that make sense at all? She said, it does. I said, and it leads me to the second very simple lesson here. I said, ma'am, failed levees created this destruction as related to the storm, but the reality is it should have also encouraged better prevention. I said, ma'am, when those levees were knocked down by Hurricane Katrina, something very powerful happened. I said, ma'am, it exposed weakness. It absolutely exposed weakness. And for all the destruction that it did in New Orleans, and it did catastrophic destruction there, the reality is, you talk to any resident in that area, they'll tell you it exposed weaknesses that were present the whole time, but were not revealed until a hard storm came. I said, ma'am, your security has to be tested in order to be trusted. And right now, you thought you were secure until you ran into this 3-year relationship that turned out to be very toxic, not to the extent of the 1-year abusive, physically and emotionally abusive relationship, but it was equally tough. But it was so tough that it did what to the levees? She started to cry. She said, Doc, it knocked them down again. I said, exactly. I said, so ma'am, it doesn't mean that those levees were never secure. It doesn't mean you didn't do the work to put or create levees in your life by doing the work. And it doesn't mean that that work didn't take place. It simply meant that those levees need to be tested, and they were tested and they failed, and that's okay. I said, what do you think your responsibility now is to do? She said, Doc, probably to go back and do what I did after the 1-year relationship. I said, exactly. I said, this was a 3-year relationship. You need to take 2 to 4 months per every year you've been in this relationship and do what? Rebuild the levees. What does rebuilding the levees look like in the context of an attachment style? I said, because it is possible. You can be absolutely secure until you meet the right storm. You can absolutely be secure until you meet the right wind. And if you're not careful, and those levees are not strong, the right storm will pull you right out of your security back into your anxiousness, right out of your security back into your avoidant behavior. I said, and that's what happened here, ma'am. I said, but give yourself grace. How are we going to rebuild the levees? Well, it's simple. You're going to go back and correct those anxieties that you have connected to this relationship. You're going to look at your relationship with things like love and abandonment. You're going to look at your relationship with things like rejection. You're going to repair your challenges that you've had as it relates to communication, how you received communication, how you gave it. There's so many different ways we can repair an attachment style. I said, but ma'am, you got to just rebuild the levees again and understand that it is possible to be secure till you meet the right storm. And you met the right storm, but now you're questioning the work that you've done when I'm here to tell you that storm was just bigger and stronger than the levees you had in place, which simply means what, ma'am? She said, that means I got to work harder. I said, exactly. I said, those levees probably would have been okay for a regular relationship, but you came right back into another toxic relationship. And it proved that even though we did 4 years of work, maybe we could have dug deeper. This is why I tell people in this space, there are truly levels to this work, because a lot of people think they've done the attachment work and put up strong levees to heal those attachment styles, only to come face to face with a much stronger storm that knocks down all the work they've done and proven that they've got to go a little bit deeper. I said, ma'am, this is no different. Give yourself some grace and recognize you can be secure until you meet people, but you can do the work to put the levees back up again. She was very gracious, very sweet woman. She's doing really well. We've had, 4 or 5 sessions since that time. And she's really done the work to repair her style. She's really growing stronger and stronger per session. And she's going to be incredibly fine. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.
The very next logical step after you heal is to let it go. I can't tell you the number of people in this space who struggle with holding on to things. People are mad at 55 over what happened to them in the breakup at 21. Those folks have gotten married, they've moved on, they've got a family. They ain't even thinking about you like that. And so once you heal mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially, the next logical step is to learn how to let go. What are we letting go? We're letting go of anything that doesn't serve us from the past, that's going to impact us in the present and might mess up our future. So if you haven't already, I need you to grab a copy of Let It Go. It's a powerful book, and it reminds us that when we learn how to let go, we can learn how to receive the best days of our life.